The Willamette Systems hatcheries, right?
Yes.
Mitigation.
Right.
Okay. Now, this is something, now, I'm an idiot, and everybody knows that, and I appreciate that, and I understand that. And I embrace the fact that I'm an idiot. But when they built dams, however many years ago,
yep.
part of the deal was that they would still maintain hatcheries and that we would have fish in the system, wasn't
right.
it?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the essence of what the mitigation obligation was. Army Corps puts flood control dams in, so we don't have Vanport flood anymore. We don't flood Kaiser and Salem and Eugene every year when the spring runoff happens.
Right.
Like, okay, so that's going to cut off all the spawning habitat, so we're going to put a hatchery in to make up for those fish.
Sure.
And that's where we've been. And there's been efforts, and there's currently efforts going to get some of the passage in and move fish above and below these dams, and it's starting to bear a little bit of fruit. It's starting to get a little bit of traction with some of those wild runs starting to establish. But the bulk of what we need is that mitigation, those hatchery fish that we all fish for. The spring Chinook you're excited about,
yeah.
The spring Chinook everybody's excited about, everywhere from Astoria to Eugene that everybody's fishing for in the Willamette system, they all come from a hatchery which is paid by the Army Corps of Engineers.
Right.
And there's been an effort, in our opinion, in the last few years for the Army Corps to say, you know, we've been doing that because we're nice, but it's not really an obligation.
Right.
And we kind of do see it as an obligation.
Sure.
So all of us fish groups, the McKenzie River Guides Association, NSIA, Steelheaders, and us, spent the last few years meeting with the Corps, and every time I have an opportunity to put our message in front of the Corps, it's been that we expect those obligation fish to be made and paid for like you've been doing for 50 years.
Right.
We want those fish put back in the stream until the wild runs can overtake that number and be sustainable. You know, work on that, great idea. In the meantime, don't stop making those hatchery fish while we sit around and wait to see what happens.
Now, there was recently a letter written that might help move that along.
That was big news. There's so many big news things happening. This is one of these other big news things that happens in the middle of stuff. But the sea lion legislation really kind of took center stage for that. But our congressional delegation from the Northwest, which is all of our Congress people from Oregon, all of our Oregon Congress people, and both of our senators wrote a letter to the Army Corps and said, we want you to make those mitigation fish to keep our fisheries going. And that's huge. I mean, we feel pretty tiny when we're meeting with, you know, the highest ups of the Army Corps, and them telling us, like, well, we don't really have to make these fish. And we think, well, we think you do.
Yeah, right.
But so now then we have our elected officials that actually approve their budgets, telling them, yeah, you really do have to make these fish for our people. That helps a lot. I mean, I'm really appreciative of, you know, Senator or Congressman Schrader again, and the whole Northwest delegation, Oregon delegation that signed on to this letter to make sure the Army Corps keeps making those fish for us.
Well, let's just hope that they don't, you know, get sideways and go, oh, we don't have to. You know, it's nice to have, you start putting the money side of it in there.
Right.
Yeah, then they're probably going to pay a little bit more of attention.
Yeah, it's just so difficult for us as a bunch of citizens or fish advocates saying, hey, we want this for our fisheries. It's really important for our fisheries. You know, CCA has definitely taken the position all the way through since before the Columbia River reform started to defend those hatchery plants in the Willamette system. That's what feeds our fisheries.
Yeah.
Our fisheries, this whole spring Chinook fishery would be nothing without those hatchery fish.
Yeah, well, we wouldn't have a fishery. We can't keep anything but hatchery fish anyway.
There you go. Imagine how many hatchery fish you release a year, and then imagine that's all the fish there are.
Right. Crazy.
Yeah, and you wouldn't be catching it. You'll see what just happened in Puget Sound when they shut off the hatchery fish, and there's so few wild fish left. They'll say you can't even catch and release anymore because there's so few fish. We can't stand the impacts on those few fish.
Right. So no fishing.
So yeah, I mean, when you cut off the hatcheries, you cut off fishing.
That would suck.
Yeah.
I mean, really.
In this Willamette system, that is the way it is. Now, building up these wild runs sounds great. I'd love to see how it looks 20 years from now, 30 years from now. In the meantime,
we need fish.
Keep making our hatchery fish.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm no biologist, but I mean, there's some signs out there that says that you know, with hatchery fish, it helps actually get those stocks back. But what do I know, really? I mean, anyway, we're going to cut to a quick break. When we come back, we're going to have one more segment with Bruce Pauly here in the studio. I want to wrap up the discussion with sea lions and, of course, the mitigation on the Willamette system, and maybe even get a report from the saltwater from Bruce as well. Maybe. Yeah, I'll twist his arm. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes.